As we stated in the previous section, we broke up the topic of types of customs entries into two sections just to make it a little bit more palatable and put us in a position to dedicate the right amount of time to what is really an important subject. Here in section 15, we're going to continue on talking about foreign trade zones. As we see in our first bullet, similar to a warehouse entry is a foreign trade zone, an FTZ entry. Operative word here, similar to a warehouse entry. Foreign trade zones are more than a little bit different, but definitely similar to a warehouse entry. Second bullet. One of the similarities is that FTZs are bonded as well, but here is where the difference comes in. Upon entering a zone, CBP allows for a much greater degree of product manipulation than in a bonded warehouse. Depending on the type of bonded warehouse, goods can go in, but they can't be touched. They have to come out the same way they came in. In an FTZ, it's the exact opposite of that. A much greater degree of manipulation. In fact, as we see in our sub-bullet, as an example, companies can use imported raw materials to manufacture finished goods in an FTZ. We use the example of BMW in South Carolina, in Spartanburg, South Carolina. That whole campus, that whole facility is one big giant FTZ. Certainly not the only example of an FTZ in the country, but a very prominent one. FTZs do not have to be manufacturing sites. It's important to point that out. The theme is the allowance for a higher degree of manipulation of a product. Third bullet. Both the entry and withdrawal of goods from an FTZ require an electronic submission to CBP. As a note, FTZs, as well as these other types of entries, will be covered in greater detail in an upcoming section of the module. FTZ operations are pretty complex. We're just talking about the different types of entries here. It's not the last time we're going to talk about foreign trade zone entries. We've talked a little bit about the difference between bonded warehouses and FTZs. Let's put a little bit more meat on the bone with a real-world example that, of course, is entitled Bonded Warehouses versus Foreign Trade Zones. You are teaching a class at a local community college on global trade, and the subject of bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones is on the syllabus for tonight's class. 5 minutes into the lecture, one of your students states that bonded warehouses and FTZs are essentially the same thing and that there's no difference between them. How do you respond to this statement? Well, like any good teacher, you want to be positive in your response. So let's start out with the commonalities in our second paragraph. The first thing you might say is that bonded warehouses and FTZs have some things in common, but they are definitely not the same thing. In terms of that common ground, bonded warehouses and FTZs both operate under the permission and auspices of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Also, in both cases, goods entering and leaving a facility require a customs entry. Whether it's a bonded warehouse or a foreign trade zone, that entry and withdrawal has to be accounted for through an entry. Moving on to the differences in our third paragraph, a big one is that FTZs are allowed a greater deal of flexibility when manipulating merchandise. In an FTZ, goods can be broken down, repacked, and even used in a manufacturing process, as we stated in the previous slide. Depending on the type of bonded warehouse, goods may not be allowed to be manipulated and must exit the facility the same way it was entered. We also mentioned that in the previous slide. Last paragraph, another big difference is the amount of time that goods can remain in an FTZ versus a bonded facility. Although it will depend on the type of permit a bonded warehouse operates under, normally goods can remain longer in an FTZ than in a bonded warehouse. There are indeed some similarities, but the differences, one can argue convincingly, are greater. FTZs, greater manipulation of product in the zone. as well as allowances to keep products in a foreign trade zone for a longer period of time. To summarize, we'll see more on this subject in upcoming sections. Moving on to a TIB. As the name would indicate, a temporary importation under bond is an entry that covers goods coming into the U.S. on a temporary basis. They're going to come in, and it's known in advance that after a certain period of time, they're going to go back out to wherever they came from or to another country. A temporary import bond, the longer name being the temporary importation under bond. Second bullet, upon placing a bond, the importer can have access to the goods and is entitled to engage in repairs, alterations, use at trade shows, etc. Something important to mention in this second bullet is the idea of a bond. We define bonds as it relates to having a surety in place to cover default on any payment of duties to the U.S. government by an importer. This is a little bit different. The bond here is a surety that says, yes, the importer is bringing the goods in, but they're also going to send them back out. If that doesn't happen, a bond can be acted upon. Also, when goods come in to the U.S. under a TIB, a temporary import bond, the goods themselves can be used for different reasons. Maybe a product is just coming in to be repaired and then shipped back out. Sometimes, but not always, goods will come in under a TIB to be used at a trade show and then shipped back out. Now, there's another mechanism through which goods can enter the country temporarily, especially for trade shows. It's called a carnet. That's a separate subject. We won't get into that right here. We're talking about temporary import bonds. But the whole idea is that goods can come into the country from overseas, not pay duties, stay for a period of time, be used for a specific purpose, and then shipped back out. Typically, third bullet, goods can stay in the country for up to 1 year, but to close out the bond, last bullet, proof of re-export is required in order to complete the process. And if the process isn't completed, U.S. Customs is going to expect that the goods are going to be entered into the commerce of the United States and potentially duties be paid on that import. If the process isn't completed, that's where the bond comes in. Second to the last slide in this section on types of customs entries. Now we're going to talk about something completely different from what we've seen thus far and talk about what's referred to as an immediate export. First bullet, one fairly unique type of entry is called an IE, an immediate export. Second bullet, IEs are used when goods are arriving to a U.S. port or airport, but will be transferred to another conveyance and immediately exported. This is some specific customs terminology we're seeing here. Transferred to another conveyance. Basically meaning that goods will come into an airport. We have an example in just 1 second. But the goods haven't cleared through customs, haven't entered into the commerce of the United States, and they're going to be transferred from one airline to another for immediate re-export to a different destination. That might sound fairly unique, but that actual scenario happens more than one thinks. Let's use an example in our third bullet. Very common. IEs are most commonly seen when a U.S. port or airport is a transit point. That's really what we just described. An air freight shipment, for example, arrives to LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, on a flight from Hong Kong and is then physically transferred to a different airline at LAX for immediate export to Guadalajara down in Jalisco, Mexico. That's common. And it's not just LAX either. There are other airports that have a lot of IEs by virtue of their geographic location and the number of inbound and outbound flights that they have. Conveyance is just another word for transportation. Transfer to another conveyance, in this instance, just means from the airline that brought the freight in from Hong Kong to LA, the physical transfer from the inbound airline to the outbound airline from LAX to Guadalajara. Those goods are physically in the country. They've not cleared through customs. They haven't entered into the commerce of the U.S. That whole exercise, as we see in our last sub-bullet point, requires an IE. Last slide. Somewhat analogous to an immediate export is what's called a T&E, a transportation and exportation entry. There's one big difference between the two. Let's see what that is. A T&E is required when goods arrive to a U.S. port or airport that will be re-exported from a different port or airport. It's not goods arriving into LAX and being transferred 500 yards to another airline at LAX. It's merchandise coming into one port or airport and being transferred to another port or airport. Quick example, third bullet. Goods arrive via ocean freight to the port of Long Beach and are trucked in bond across the United States to Miami Airport for export to Buenos Aires, Argentina. That's not unusual. That happens fairly frequently, actually. In order to do that, one needs a T&E. Last bullet, the T&E covers the in-bond transportation, in our instance from LAX down to Miami, and must be closed out upon final exportation. IEs and T&Es are different, clearly related to goods physically in the country but not having entered into the commerce of the country and that are going to be leaving rather quickly, whether it's from the same airport or port of arrival in the case of an IE or from a different port of arrival or departure, as in the case of a T&E. Those are different types of customs entries as well. All right, that's it for this section. When we pick back up, now we're moving on to important pre-importation considerations. Things like customs bonds, working with customs brokers, etc. See you then.